A quiet forest ranger stumbles upon an old stone cabin deep in the woods, one that no map remembers and no one has claimed. He assumes it's empty, just another forgotten place swallowed by time. But when he steps inside and discovers a hidden room, he realizes this old stone cabin isn't abandoned at all. It's been waiting guarding a secret powerful enough to reopen wounds, restore hope, and change everything. Subscribe for more emotional stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Jack wasn't the kind of man who chased mysteries. He was quiet, steady, 43 years old, and weathered by years of service in the National Forest Patrol. He liked maps, routines, coffee made the same way every morning. After the divorce, the woods had become the only place that still made sense. Out here, things didn't lie. Trees either stood or they didn't. The river ran or it didn't. There was comfort in that. So, when he was reassigned to the northern ridge, a stretch of remote land barely touched since the 80s, he didn't think much of it. Just another watchtower, another radio, another month of solitude. Then he saw the stone cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, not in the ranger's database, not on old Forest Service logs, just a square of stone half swallowed by moss and time, tucked off a deer trail as if it had been hiding. At first, Jack thought it was nothing. Abandoned, maybe. Just a ruin. But something about it felt paused. Like the building was holding its breath. He should have kept walking. But that's the thing about places like this. They don't call you in with noise. They wait, quietly, until someone's ready to listen. He hesitated at the threshold. The door to the stone cabin wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully shut. One gust of wind would have pushed it open. Jack ran his fingers along the edge of the wood-old, splintering in places, but strong. The handle was cool to the touch, like metal left untouched for years. He wasn't sure what he expected. A pile of raccoon droppings. Maybe. Cobwebs in the corners. Rotten floorboards. What he didn't expect was warmth. Not in temperature, but in presence. The kind of warmth that comes from a room that once mattered to someone. The kind that lingers after laughter dies out and silence moves in to take its place. The door creaked as he opened it. Inside was dust, plenty of it, but also structure. Order, a single chair facing the fireplace, a table, still sturdy, with a faded cloth draped over it like it had been placed there without thought, and never touched again. Books stacked unevenly on a narrow shelf. A kettle hanging over cold ashes. A tin mug still sitting beside it. Everything was still, but not abandoned. It felt paused. Jack's boots crunched softly on the stone floor as he stepped inside. The cabin was no bigger than his apartment back in town, but somehow it felt deeper, as though it held more space than its walls allowed. He swept his flashlight across the far corner. A cot, thin mattress, wool blanket folded neatly. On the floor beneath it a small wooden box. Closed, but not locked. The kind people used to keep letters in. He crouched slowly, letting the weight of silence press around him. Then, gently, he pulled the box out. The lid creaked open. Inside envelopes, dozens of them, some sealed, others not. All aged, yellowed edges. Ink faded but legible. Every single one addressed to the same name. Isaac. Jack didn't recognize it. Could have been a son, a brother, a lover, a ghost. He picked up the top letter. It wasn't sealed. The handwriting was steady, precise. I waited again today. Thought maybe you'd changed your mind. The path's still clear. The light's still in the window. Maybe tomorrow, maybe then. It wasn't signed. Jack set it down carefully. His throat tightened. But he didn't know why. He opened another. You once said silence was better than saying the wrong thing. But silence becomes its own kind of wrong after too long, doesn't it? He didn't read any more. He didn't need to, not yet, because something else had caught his attention. The floor just beside the hearth wore oddly a soft dip, not accidental, like someone had stepped in that same spot 100 times too many. He stepped over and looked down. The stone beneath his boot was smoother than the rest. Jack knelt and ran his fingers along the edge of the floor tile. It moved, just lightly. He wedged the handle of his multi-tool beneath it and gently pried upward. The stone shifted with a soft groan, revealing a hollow space beneath just big enough for a small satchel or box. And there it was, wrapped in oilcloth, bound with twine. He pulled it out, heart knocking louder now. The cloth peeled back to reveal a leather-bound journal, scuffed and nearly falling apart at the seams. He opened it. First page to Isaac. If I never see you again, please know. I tried. Jack stopped breathing for a moment. This wasn't just a hiding place. This was a memorial, a confessional. And he had walked straight into it like a trespasser on sacred ground. He closed the journal slowly, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was holding. He looked around the cabin again. The books, the mug, the blanket folded just so. None of this was accidental. Someone had lived here. Someone had waited here. Someone had held on to hope long enough to leave behind their words when hope finally left them. And now those words were his to read, or carry, or deliver. Jack sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, the journal in his lap, the dust floating quietly in the sunbeam now filtering through the single window. He hadn't come looking for a story, but one had found him, and he had a feeling it wasn't finished yet. Jack didn't sleep that night. He lay in the ranger's outpost, just a mile downhill from the cabin, the journal resting on the table beside his cot like it might whisper to him in the dark. Outside, the trees stirred in the wind, branches tapping against the tin roof like a second hand ticking down time he didn't know he was racing. He had read only a few pages, enough to know the man who lived in the stone cabin was named Thomas, and Thomas had been waiting. Not for a delivery, not for help, for someone. Isaac. Jack didn't know who Isaac was, but the name had appeared again and again in Thomas's writing, sometimes with longing, sometimes with frustration, sometimes so raw it felt like Jack was eavesdropping on something sacred. He returned the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a notebook of his own. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, still holding its breath. He sat down at the old table and opened the journal again. You always said you'd come when the snow melted. I marked every spring by that hope. I grew older with it. I didn't mind. Hope is better company than silence, even when it lies. Jack read page after page. Sometimes the entries were no more than a line or two. Sometimes they ran for pages full of sketches, half-remembered memories, and sorrow so deeply buried between the lines. It only surfaced in the way certain words were repeated. But then he found something else. Tucked between the pages, a photo. Faded, folded once in the center. 2 young men standing by a river. Shirt sleeves rolled, laughing. Jack stared at it, then flipped it over. A single sentence written in pen. The last summer before we said nothing. It hit him in the chest harder than it should have. Maybe because Jack had people he used to laugh with too before things got quiet. Before life became about surviving instead of feeling. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. And then he noticed it. On the far wall of the cabin, just beside the narrow bookshelf where the light rarely touched, was a dark patch. He hadn't looked closely before. He stood, flashlight in hand, and stepped over. It wasn't just a stain. It was a seam. A square nearly flush with the stone, camouflaged by decades of dust and clever design. He pressed his fingers to the edges, cold, solid. Then he felt it a soft give beneath the top left corner. He applied pressure. Click. A section of the wall popped inward with a mechanical sigh, revealing a small hollow compartment no larger than a suitcase. Inside, another box, not wood, metal, sealed with a rusted latch. Jack's pulse quickened. He undid the latch and lifted the lid. Inside were items so carefully placed. It felt like opening a time capsule built not for memory, but for mercy. A second journal thinner, with the initials I.M. etched faintly on the cover. A pocket watch, hands frozen at 6:13. A pair of dog tags, and a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in the same handwriting. To whoever finds this, please, if he's still out there, give this to Isaac. Jack stood frozen for a long time. The silence of the cabin was no longer silence. It was pressure. It was request. He sat down again, this time holding the envelope like it might disappear if he blinked. He didn't open it. It wasn't his to open. But something inside him shifted then deep and unmistakable. He wasn't just a ranger anymore. He was a witness, and maybe now, a messenger. He returned the envelope to the box, gently, as if placing a fragile heart back into a chest. Then he opened the second journal. The first page read, "I couldn't write back. I didn't know how to answer a man I'd already buried inside myself. But I never stopped reading. Not once. I just didn't think he'd keep writing." Jack closed the journal and stared at the wall. This wasn't a story about loss. It was a story about two people caught in the pause between apology and pride. And it had waited here quietly, patiently for someone who would care enough to listen. Jack stood. He didn't know where Isaac was. He didn't know if he was alive, but somewhere, someone deserved to know that he was loved, even when the words went unsaid. Jack had always considered himself a man of facts. He liked systems, schedules, answers that fit neatly inside boxes. The woods gave him that kind of certainty. Trees didn't lie. Maps didn't shift overnight. Wildlife followed instinct, not mood. But now, he sat in a cabin that wasn't on any map, reading words written by a man who had built his own kind of compass not to navigate the forest, but to navigate his own regret. That night, Jack didn't go back to the outpost. He stayed in the cabin. He lit a fire in the old hearth. The first flame the room had likely seen in years. The smoke crept upward through the cracked chimney. And for a moment, Jack imagined the cabin exhaling, relieved that someone had finally returned. He boiled water, made tea with pine needles, opened the thinner journal. Every line felt like it had waited for someone to understand it. We were boys when we made promises. We were men when we let them fall apart. And somewhere in between. I stopped writing because I thought I didn't deserve to be remembered. Isaac hadn't just read Thomas's letters. He had carried them. Privately, quietly, but he never came. Jack leaned back in the chair, staring at the rafters. What kind of silence lives in a man for that long? What kind of love do you bury, year after year, until it becomes stone? For the first time in his life, Jack realized he wasn't just reading about someone else. He was seeing himself, because Jack had someone, too, a brother, Nate. They hadn't spoken in years. It wasn't any one fight, just time, pride, unsaid things that festered quietly until distance felt more comfortable than closeness. And now, here he was, holding the echo of a story that had ended the same way his was heading unfinished. The next morning, Jack gathered everything, both journals, the envelope, the photo. He placed them gently in his rucksack. He didn't know where Isaac was, but he knew where to start. Back at the ranger station, he dug into old census data, archived directories, obituary listings, small-town records. It took days, but finally buried inside an outdated church newsletter from a county 2 states away, he found it. Isaac Montgomery, retired postal worker, volunteer pianist, last seen at the Willow Creek Senior Center. Jack stared at the screen, heart pounding. Still alive? He scribbled down the address, packed a weekend bag, and took 3 days off. His supervisor didn't ask questions. Jack didn't offer any. Driving into Willow Creek felt like driving into a different decade. The sidewalks were cracked, the buildings small, unassuming. But it was the kind of town where people still nodded at strangers and held the door without thinking. Jack parked outside the senior center, took a long breath, then another. He hadn't rehearsed what he would say. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. A woman at the desk greeted him with a warm, tired smile. "Can I help you?" Jack cleared his throat. "I'm looking for a man named Isaac Montgomery." Her eyes lit with recognition. "Oh, Mr. Isaac. He's in the garden. He plays piano in the afternoons, but he takes his mornings outside. Quiet man." Jack nodded, heart thudding. "Thank you." The garden was small, just a few benches and raised beds, but sunlight filtered through the trees in soft ribbons. And there, near the back, sat a man alone. Upright posture, white hair combed back, a book open in his lap. Jack knew before he spoke. This was him. "Mr. Montgomery?" he asked softly. The man looked up slowly, eyes narrowing behind gold-rimmed glasses. "Yes." Jack stepped forward, hands trembling slightly. He reached into his bag, pulled out the envelope, and held it out with both hands. "I think this was meant for you." Isaac stared at the envelope. He didn't take it right away. He just looked at it like it was a ghost, not a letter. Then, with hands more certain than Jack expected, he accepted it, turned it over, read the name, ran his thumb along the crease. "How did you—" "I found a cabin," Jack said, his cabin. Silence fell between them, thick, sacred. Isaac swallowed, blinked several times, and then said, voice barely audible, "I thought he hated me." Jack shook his head. "He waited for you, until he couldn't anymore." Isaac didn't cry. He just nodded, as if the past had finally found him, and instead of punishment it had come home with forgiveness. They sat in silence for a while. Jack didn't rush it. Some moments deserved to stretch. When Isaac finally opened the envelope, his hands were steady, and as he read the letter inside, Jack looked away, not out of disinterest, but respect, because some words were never meant for a third pair of eyes. Jack didn't expect to hear from Isaac again. After handing over the letter in the garden, he'd offered a quiet nod and turned to leave. He figured some doors once opened weren't meant to be walked back through. They just needed to be unlocked, for someone else to step through at their own pace. But a week later, a small envelope arrived at the ranger outpost. No return address, just his name, handwritten in elegant, slightly shaky script. Inside was a note. "You gave me something I thought I'd buried with the last of my good years. A name I haven't spoken aloud in decades now echoes in my chest. I'm not asking for more, but if you're willing, I'd like to go back, one last time." It was signed simply Isaac. Jack folded the note slowly, staring out at the forest from the window above his desk. And he knew This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of its reckoning. They met 3 days later. Isaac arrived by bus, suitcase in hand, the same way he must have moved through the world for years, quietly, with intention. Jack helped him into the truck, neither of them saying much during the drive. The road was long, the kind that curved not just through trees, but through memory. When they arrived at the base of the trail, Jack offered a hand, but Isaac waved him off with a small grin. I've walked harder paths for less. It took them a while. The climb wasn't easy for someone Isaac's age, but he never asked to rest, never complained. And when they reached the edge of the clearing, and the stone cabin revealed itself between the pines, Isaac stopped. He didn't move forward. Didn't blink. He just stood there, like the years had collapsed into a single breath. Then he whispered, "He kept it." They approached slowly. Jack unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room had been left untouched. Jack had made sure of it. The journals still sat on the table. The sealed box remained in its place. The firewood was stacked neatly beside the hearth. It smelled like pine and dust, and something else. Anticipation. Isaac stepped inside like a man returning to a version of himself he had forgotten how to carry. He ran a hand along the shelf, paused at the kettle. Then he turned to Jack. "Would you mind waiting outside?" Jack nodded. "Of course." He stepped out and sat on the porch. The wind moved gently through the trees. A crow called from somewhere deep in the canopy. The cabin behind him was silent, but full, like a room finally allowed to speak. Nearly an hour passed. When the door opened again, Isaac looked different. Not younger, not lighter, but anchored, as if the weight of silence had shifted position inside him. No longer pressing, just resting. He held the box now, carefully, like it was the last fragile thing in a world full of noise. "He built this for me," Isaac said. "Not just the box, the room, this whole place." Jack didn't speak. He didn't need to. Isaac stared out at the trees. "We had a fight. It wasn't even big. It was pride in small doses, too many doses. I thought silence would teach him a lesson. Then a year passed, then 5, and then it just became the way we existed. Two people pretending the other didn't matter as much as they did." He looked at Jack. "Do you know the worst part of living too long? It's not the pain, it's not the memory. It's knowing how many chances you had to say something and didn't." Jack's throat tightened. His own thoughts flicked briefly to his brother. Nate. A number in his phone he hadn't called in 3 years. Isaac set the box down on the porch rail. "I don't know what I'll do with this," he said, "but I know I don't want to leave it behind again." Jack nodded. "You don't have to." They sat for a while longer, neither rushing to fill the silence. The sun began to dip behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long across the clearing. As they stood to leave, Isaac placed a hand on the cabin's frame, just for a second. "Thank you," he whispered, not to Jack, but to the place, to the stones, to the man who had waited. That night, Jack returned alone. He stood in the middle of the cabin and felt, for the first time, like the air had shifted, like something had closed not in grief, but in grace. He took out his phone, stared at the screen for a long time. Then, with hands steadier than he expected, he scrolled to a name he hadn't tapped in years. Nate. He hit call and waited. The phone rang 5 times, then 6, then hello. Jack froze. He hadn't heard Nate's voice in almost 4 years. It was deeper now, rougher. Or maybe it had always sounded that way and Jack had just forgotten. "It's me," Jack said. A pause. The kind of pause where years hang in the air like smoke. "I know," Nate answered quietly. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Jack laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because it felt like the only thing holding back everything else. "I didn't call to fix things," he said. "I don't even know if I can. But I found something, a place, a story, and I just wanted you to know it made me think of you." Another pause. Then Nate's voice, softer than Jack remembered. "You okay?" Jack sat down on the cabin's front step. "I am now." 3 days passed. Jack thought that would be it. One call, a beginning, a thread pulled. But on the 4th morning, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address, just a first name at the bottom. Nate. He hadn't expected that. The letter was short, honest, a little awkward. It mentioned the cabin, asked about the man named Thomas, said something like, "Funny how someone else's unfinished story makes you look at your own differently." Jack folded the letter slowly, stared at the hearth. He had gone into that cabin thinking it was about someone else. Now it was starting to rewrite him. The snow came early that year. By mid-October, the ridge was already dusted white. The trail to the cabin became harder to hike. Jack started keeping firewood inside, clearing the path weekly, not because he expected anyone, but because it felt right. Like maintenance wasn't just about structure, it was about memory. One morning, while clearing the front porch, he noticed something strange. A pair of the boot prints. Not his. They were smaller, lighter, not the deep, heavy steps of someone carrying gear, just a visitor. They led up to the door, then back down the path. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. Just a silent arrival and departure. He checked the journals, unmoved, the box still sealed. But on the table, right in the center, was a single envelope. No name. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." Jack stared at it for a long time, then smiled, just a little. Someone had come back. Maybe not Isaac. Maybe not Nate. Maybe someone else entirely. But the cabin had received another story, another reckoning. It was doing what it was built to do. A week later, Jack received an unexpected call from the Willow Creek Senior Center. Isaac had passed, peacefully, in his sleep, a small stroke. They said he'd left instructions in case the ranger ever checked in. A small box and a note. Jack made the drive back under gray skies and bare branches. The woman at the front desk handed him the box with both hands, like it held something holy. Inside were the dog tags, the old photograph of the 2 young men at the river, and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You gave me something I didn't know I still needed the chance to be remembered, and the courage to forgive myself. I couldn't bring myself to open the letter, not yet, but I kept it. I held it every night. That was enough. Thank you for being the one to find him, even when I couldn't." Jack closed the box and held it to his chest for a long, silent minute. When he returned to the cabin, he built a small stone marker just outside the porch. Nothing grand. Just a flat slab with 2 initials carved into it. T and I. He buried the dog tags beneath it, placed the photograph under glass inside the cabin, and as he sat in the wooden chair by the fire, he realized something. This cabin wasn't haunted by the past. It was filled with the quiet proof that healing didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be welcomed. Later that evening, as snow began to fall outside, Jack heard a sound on the porch. He stood, opened the door. Nate stood there, hood pulled back, face older, but familiar. "I brought coffee," he said, lifting a thermos. Jack stepped aside. "Come in." The cabin was warm that night. not just from the fire Jack had stoked to life, but from the presence of two people who hadn't shared silence in far too long. Nate stood by the bookshelf, tracing his fingers along the spines of books left untouched by time. Jack poured 2 mugs of coffee, one for his brother, one for himself, and placed them on the table. Right where Thomas used to leave his. Nate sat down slowly, eyes scanning the space. "It's strange," he said, voice low. "Feels like this place breathes." Jack nodded. "It does." They sat in silence for a while. The fire cracked gently, casting shadows across the stone walls. Outside, snow fell soft and steady. Inside, something else was thawing. "Who was he?" Nate finally asked. Jack reached for the journal, the thinner one, the one marked with Isaac's initials. He slid it across the table. His name was Thomas. He waited for someone, too. Nate opened the cover, read the first few lines. Then he paused. "You ever wonder what makes someone wait that long?" Jack looked toward the fire. Maybe love? Or regret? Maybe both. Nate set the journal down. "You think he forgave him?" "I think," Jack said carefully, "he never stopped hoping he'd get the chance." They both knew that kind of hoping. They had lived it in different ways, with different wounds, but it came from the same place, a place that longed for reconnection, but didn't know how to ask for it. "I don't even remember what we stopped talking about," Nate admitted. "Just one day it felt easier not to call than to say something stupid." Jack gave a sad smile. "Funny how silence feels safer than truth, until it's not." Nate nodded. Outside, the snow thickened. Jack reached for a blanket and tossed it to his brother. Nate caught it one-handed, just like he always did when they were kids. That simple movement sparked something in old memory. Unspoken, but shared. "You know," Nate said softly, "I almost didn't come." Jack turned to him. "Why did you—" Nate sipped his coffee. "Because you did." Those 3 words settled between them. Not dramatic, not emotional, just true. They stayed 2 nights in the cabin. They didn't talk constantly. They didn't need to. Sometimes, healing looks like drinking coffee beside someone who used to feel like a stranger and realizing the silence doesn't hurt anymore. On the last morning, before they packed up, Jack led Nate outside. He showed him the marker beneath the tree, the small pile of stones, the initials carved carefully. "T and I," Nate said. "Thomas and Isaac." Jack nodded. "He left this place full of unanswered questions, but I think the fact that we're here, that someone came back, maybe that's answer enough." Nate crouched down, ran his hand over the stone. They waited too long. "Yeah." Nate looked up at him. "Let's not." A week later, Jack returned alone. The cabin felt different now. Not because something was missing, but because something had been fulfilled. The air no longer held its breath. The books no longer sat in mourning. The journal, now resting closed on the table, felt like it could finally sleep. Jack lit one last fire. He didn't need the heat. He just wanted the cabin to feel alive one more time. Then, he stood in the doorway, took one long look at the room, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't mean just the place. He meant the man who wrote letters he never sent, the man who kept hope warm through winters that never answered, the man who built silence into a shelter, so that one day someone like Jack could walk in and learn how to listen. Back at the ranger station, Jack opened a new journal. The first page, he didn't start with his name. He started with his brother's. "Nate came to the cabin. We sat in the quiet, and it was enough." He wrote like he was leaving a breadcrumb trail. in case anyone else got lost like Thomas had. Because the truth is, some people wait a lifetime to be found. Others build places to be remembered, not rescued. But every so often, when the timing is right and someone finally listens, a story finds its way home. And that's what the cabin had become. Not a mystery, not a monument, but a message. It's never too late to speak, but it's never too early to forgive. Sometimes we think silence is safer than speaking up. We wait, we delay. We tell ourselves that tomorrow will be the day we finally reach out. The old stone cabin wasn't haunted by anything supernatural. It was haunted by regret, by words written too late, by love never sent. Thomas didn't die because he was forgotten. He died while remembering. And it was the act of being found that finally gave his story a resting place. Jack didn't just uncover a hidden journal. He uncovered what happens when we choose to listen. And in doing so, he found the courage to turn his own silence into something else. A bridge. Because sometimes we don't need to fix the past. We just need to honor it and let it teach us how to begin again. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. We share quiet stories that stay long after they end. And if it reminded you of someone, send it their way. Sometimes, all it takes is one message to open a closed door.